The morning mist clung to the dense Virginia underbrush like the breath of ghosts as Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant's massive Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River on May 4, 1864. The tangled wilderness ahead stretched for miles, a labyrinth of second-growth forest, brambles, and shadows that would soon swallow whole regiments and transform organized warfare into a nightmare of confusion and terror. Grant had been promoted to General-in-Chief just 2 months earlier, bearing the weight of Northern expectations and Abraham Lincoln's desperate hope for a commander who could finally bring the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia to its knees. Unlike his predecessors, Grant had no intention of retreating after the first bloody encounter. His plan was audaciously simple: march through the wilderness as quickly as possible, emerge into open country where his superior numbers and artillery could be effectively deployed, and force Robert E. Lee into a decisive engagement. But Lee, the master tactician who had confounded Union generals for 3 years, had other plans. From his headquarters at Orange Courthouse, the Confederate commander watched Grant's movements with the keen eye of a chess master. The wilderness, with its choking undergrowth and limited visibility, was the perfect equalizer, a place where Grant's numerical advantage would mean nothing and where Lee's intimate knowledge of the terrain could tip the scales. As Grant's 118,000 men began their march south, they moved in 3 massive columns. General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps led the way, followed by General Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps, while General John Sedgwick's 6th Corps brought up the rear. The soldiers, many of them veterans of countless battles, sensed something different about this campaign. There was a grim determination in Grant's orders, a finality that suggested this time there would be no turning back. According to detailed accounts preserved in the National Archives and referenced in James M. McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, the initial crossing proceeded with remarkable efficiency despite the challenging terrain. The wilderness itself was a monument to human folly and nature's resilience. Decades earlier, iron furnaces had stripped the original forest bare, leaving behind a secondary growth of stunted oak, pine, and dense underbrush that created an almost impenetrable maze. Visibility rarely extended beyond 50 yards, and in many places, it was impossible to see more than 20 feet in any direction. The forest floor was carpeted with dead leaves and fallen branches that would later prove tragically flammable. Lee's army, numbering approximately 66,000 men, was divided into 2 corps under Lieutenant General Richard S. Ewell and Lieutenant General A.P. Hill, with Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps still marching to join them. Despite being outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, Lee felt confident in his ability to use the terrain to his advantage. As the Union columns snaked deeper into the green hell, soldiers began to experience an eerie foreboding. The forest seemed to press in on them from all sides, muffling sounds and creating a sense of claustrophobic dread. Veterans who had survived Gettysburg and Antietam would later describe the wilderness as the most terrifying battlefield they had ever encountered, not for its initial violence, but for its suffocating atmosphere of impending doom. By evening on May 4th, Grant's forces had established camps throughout the eastern edge of the wilderness, unaware that less than 10 miles away, Lee was positioning his forces for an attack that would transform this seemingly routine march into one of the bloodiest and most confusing battles of the entire Civil War. Dawn on May 5, 1864, broke gray and humid over the wilderness, with tendrils of fog weaving through the dense undergrowth like specters preparing for the carnage to come. General Warren's 5th Corps had resumed its march south along the Orange Turnpike when advance scouts brought disturbing news. Confederate forces were moving eastward along the same road, directly across their path. Grant, established at his EA field headquarters near Wilderness Tavern, received the report with characteristic calm. Unlike previous Union commanders who might have hesitated or retreated, Grant saw opportunity in the unexpected encounter. If Lee wanted to fight in this God-forsaken forest, then they would fight. He immediately ordered Warren to halt his advance and deploy for battle, while dispatching urgent messages to Hancock and Sedgwick to bring their corps into position. But Lee had anticipated this moment perfectly. His Army of Northern Virginia had spent the night positioning itself along two parallel roads, the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road, creating a deadly cross that would intersect Grant's line of march. Ewell's Second Corps controlled the Turnpike, while Hill's Third Corps held the Plank Road. It was a masterpiece of tactical positioning that would fragment the coming battle into a series of disconnected, savage encounters. The first shots rang, out around 7 in the morning when Warren's skirmishers encountered Confederate pickets near Saunders Field, a small clearing that would become a focal point of the day's fighting. What began as a probe quickly escalated as both sides fed more troops into the engagement, transforming a reconnaissance in force into a full-scale battle. General Charles Griffin's division led Warren's assault, but the dense undergrowth immediately broke up their formations. Regiments that had marched in perfect order minutes before found themselves scattered and disoriented, with officers shouting commands to men they could not see. The forest canopy filtered the morning sunlight into an eerie green twilight that made it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Contemporary accounts from the official records of the War of the Rebellion, as cited in Gordon C. Ria's definitive study, The Battle of the Wilderness, describe the confusion and terror that immediately gripped both armies as traditional military formations proved useless in the tangled undergrowth. Ewell's Confederates, many of them veterans of Stonewall Jackson's old corps, adapted more quickly to the chaotic conditions. They had fought in these woods before and understood instinctively how to use the terrain. Confederate brigades under Generals John B. Gordon, Robert Rhodes, and Edward Johnson spread out through the wilderness like hunting parties, using the thick cover to approach within yards of Union positions before opening devastating volleys. The battle quickly devolved into what soldiers would later describe as bushwhacking on a grand scale. Traditional military tactics became meaningless as regiments lost contact with their flanks and companies became separated from their parent units. Officers found themselves leading men from different regiments entirely, while perfectly good, soldiers wandered through the forest seeking their commands. Meanwhile, several miles to the south, an even more savage encounter was developing along the Orange Plank Road. General Getty's division of Sedgwick's corps had been rushed forward to secure the intersection where the Plank Road crossed the Germania Plank Road, but they arrived to find Hill's Confederate corps already in position. The fighting along the Plank Road was, if anything, even more confused than the battle to the north. The undergrowth was so thick that artillery was nearly useless, and cavalry charges were impossible. Everything depended on the individual courage and marksmanship of soldiers fighting in groups of 10 or 20, often completely cut off from higher command. As the morning progressed, both battles raged with increasing fury, but neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The forest had become a great equalizer, reducing the war's most sophisticated armies to something resembling frontier Indian fighting. Grant's numerical superiority meant nothing when regiments could not maintain formation, and Lee's tactical brilliance was hampered by his inability to coordinate his scattered forces. By noon, the wilderness was filled with the sounds of musketry, the screams of wounded men, and the desperate shouts of officers trying to maintain some semblance of control over the chaos that had consumed both armies. As the morning battles raged along the Orange Turnpike and Orange Plank Road, General Winfield, Scott Hancock received urgent orders that would transform him from a spectator into the protagonist of the wilderness drama. Grant's message was characteristically direct. March north immediately and strike Hill's exposed left flank along the Orange Plank Road with everything available. Hancock, nicknamed Hancock the Superb for his aggressive leadership and tactical brilliance, commanded the Second Corps, arguably the finest fighting force in the Union Army. His 4 divisions, totaling nearly 30,000 men, had been marching south toward Shady Grove Church when the call came to reverse course and join the battle. Despite the confusion of countermarching through the narrow forest roads, Hancock's veterans responded with the discipline that had made them legendary. The approach march was a nightmare of logistics and endurance. The Germania Plank Road, barely wide enough for a single wagon, became choked with artillery pieces, supply wagons, and thousands of marching soldiers. The spring heat, intensified by the forest canopy, created a greenhouse effect that left men gasping for air as they struggled through clouds of dust kicked up by the massive column. Lieutenant General A.P. Hill, commanding the Confederate Third Corps along the Orange Plank Road, found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. His 2 divisions under Generals Henry Heth and Cadmus Wilcox had been fighting Getty's division since early morning, and his men were exhausted. Hill had repeatedly requested reinforcement from Lee, but Longstreet's corps was still hours away from reaching the battlefield. Military historians, as documented in Edward Steers Jr.'s The Wilderness Campaign, note that Hill's position represented one of the most precarious tactical situations faced by any Confederate Corps commander during the entire war. When Hancock's lead division under General David Birney finally reached the Orange Plank Road intersection shortly after 11 in the morning, the tactical situation was immediately clear. Hill's Confederates, strung out along a thin line perpendicular to the road, were desperately holding their position against Getty's frontal assault. Hancock could see that a coordinated attack by his fresh troops would likely shatter Hill's line and potentially roll up Lee's entire right flank. The Union assault, when it came, was devastating in its power and precision. Hancock deployed his divisions in a massive formation that stretched for nearly a mile through the forest. General Francis Barlow's division struck from the north, while Birney's men attacked along the road itself, and General Gershom Mott's division attempted to turn the Confederate left flank. The sound of 30,000 men crashing through the underbrush was like thunder rolling through the forest. Hill's Confederate line, already stretched to its breaking point, began to crumble almost immediately. Heth's division, which had borne the brunt of the morning's fighting, broke first. Entire regiments threw down their weapons and fled westward through the forest, while others fought desperate rearguard actions around fallen logs and in thickets that provided momentary cover. The retreat quickly became a rout. Confederate soldiers, many of them veterans of dozens of battles, abandoned their positions and ran through the forest with Hancock's triumphant troops in pursuit. Artillery pieces were abandoned, battle flags were captured, and for a terrifying moment it appeared that Lee's Army of Northern Virginia might suffer its first complete tactical defeat. General Lee himself, realizing the magnitude of the crisis, rode forward to rally his retreating troops. In one of the most dramatic moments of his entire military career, the normally composed Confederate commander drew his sword and attempted to personally lead a desperate counterattack. Only the intervention of his subordinates, who physically turned his horse around while shouting, "Lee to the rear!" prevented the Confederate commander from charging into Hancock's advancing lines. Hill's corps was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Of the approximately 15,000 men who had begun the day in his ranks, nearly half were casualties or had fled the field. The Orange Plank Road lay open, and Grant's forces seemed poised to achieve the breakthrough that had eluded the Union Army for 3 years. But Lee's salvation was already marching through the forest from the southwest. Longstreet's corps, after an exhausting night march, was finally approaching the battlefield, and with them came Lee's last hope of preventing a catastrophic defeat. The thunderous sound of Hancock's assault could be heard for miles through the wilderness as Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps raced through the forest toward the collapsing Confederate line. Longstreet, Lee's most reliable subordinate and the architect of defensive victories at Fredericksburg and Gettysburg, understood that the next hour would likely determine the fate of the Confederacy. His corps, consisting of the divisions commanded, by Generals Charles Field and Joseph Kershaw, represented the last uncommitted reserve available to Lee's army. These 20,000 veterans had marched through the night from their positions near Gordonsville, guided by flickering torches and driven forward by the increasingly desperate sound of battle echoing through the darkness. As dawn broke on May 6, 1864, Longstreet's exhausted soldiers could see smoke rising above the forest canopy and hear the unmistakable sounds of a retreating army. Scattered groups of Hill's men were streaming westward through the trees, their faces blackened with powder and their eyes wide with the shock of defeat. Many had thrown away their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape Hancock's relentless pursuit. Longstreet deployed his corps with the tactical genius that had made him legendary. Rather than simply forming a defensive line across the Orange Plank Road, he positioned Field's division to meet Hancock's frontal assault while secretly maneuvering Kershaw's division through an unfinished railroad cut that ran parallel to the Union advance. This flanking movement, if successful, would strike Hancock's exposed left flank and potentially turn the Union victory into a catastrophic defeat. According to detailed battle reports preserved in the Library of Congress and analyzed in Jeffrey D. Wirt's General James Longstreet, this flanking maneuver represented one of the most audacious tactical movements attempted by any Confederate commander during the war. The head-on collision between Longstreet's fresh troops and Hancock's advancing divisions created some of the most savage fighting of the entire Civil War. In the dense undergrowth along the Orange Plank Road, soldiers fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and even fists as organized warfare degenerated into a series of personal duels to the death. The forest canopy trapped the acrid smoke of thousands of muskets, creating an artificial twilight that made it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Field's Confederates, despite their exhaustion from the night march, fought with the desperation of men who understood that defeat meant the end of their cause. They met Hancock's assault in a series of small clearings and along narrow forest paths, where individual acts of heroism and cowardice would determine the fate of entire regiments. But it was Kershaw's flanking movement that transformed the battle's trajectory. Moving through the abandoned railroad cut, his South Carolina and Georgia brigades approached Hancock's left flank completely undetected. The Union Second Corps, focused on their pursuit of Hill's retreating forces, had no idea that 2,500 Confederate veterans were preparing to strike them from an unexpected direction. The flank attack, when it came, was devastating in its surprise and effectiveness. Kershaw's men emerged from the railroad cut with the rebel yell echoing through the forest, striking Hancock's exposed divisions while they were still engaged with Field's troops to their front. The Union left flank, composed primarily of General Mott's division, collapsed almost immediately as soldiers found themselves under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. General Hancock, realizing the magnitude of the threat, desperately attempted to redirect his forces to meet this new danger. But in the confused terrain of the wilderness, redeploying large formations was nearly impossible. Regiments became separated from their brigades. Companies lost contact with their parent units, and the careful organization that had made Hancock's initial assault so effective dissolved into chaos. The Confederate counterattack gained momentum as more of Longstreet's troops joined the flanking movement. What had begun as a tactical maneuver by a single division expanded into a general assault that threatened to envelop Hancock's entire corps. Union soldiers who had been advancing confidently just hours earlier now found themselves retreating through the same forest paths, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape encirclement. For Lee, watching from his position near the Tapp Farm, Longstreet's counterattack represented vindication of his tactical gamble in choosing to fight in the wilderness. The forest that had seemed like such an advantage to Grant's massive army was now working in favor of the Confederates, allowing a smaller force to achieve tactical surprise and potentially decisive results. As Longstreet's counterattack reached its crescendo, the wilderness itself became an active participant in the carnage. The unseasonably dry conditions, combined with the countless musket flashes and artillery discharges, ignited the forest floor's carpet of dead leaves and dry underbrush. What began as isolated smoldering spots quickly spread into raging fires that would add a new dimension of horror to an already hellish battle. The first flames appeared near the Orange Plank Road around 2 in the afternoon of May 6, 1864, just as Kershaw's flanking attack was driving Hancock's forces back toward their starting positions. Union and Confederate soldiers alike watched in growing alarm as tendrils of smoke began rising from the forest floor, driven by a light wind that fanned the sparks into hungry flames. Within minutes, the fire had spread across hundreds of acres, creating walls of flame that advanced through the underbrush faster than a man could run. Wounded soldiers, unable to crawl to safety, screamed in terror as the flames approached their positions. The acrid smoke, already thick from gunpowder, became a choking black cloud that reduced visibility to mere yards and made breathing nearly impossible. Contemporary accounts preserved in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, as referenced in Stephen W. Sears' Gettysburg, describe the forest fire as transforming the battlefield into a vision of hell that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. General Longstreet, despite the success of his counterattack, recognized that the fire posed as much danger to his own troops as to the enemy. His advancing divisions found their momentum broken as soldiers were forced to detour around walls of flame or stop to rescue wounded comrades threatened by the approaching fire. The Confederate flanking movement, which had promised to deliver a decisive blow against Hancock's corps, gradually lost its cohesion as unit commanders made individual decisions about how to respond to the spreading conflagration. The human cost of the fire was devastating. Hundreds of wounded soldiers from both armies, lying helpless in the underbrush, were burned alive as the flames swept over their positions. Their screams could be heard above the sound of battle, creating a psychological trauma that affected even veteran soldiers accustomed to the horrors of war. Many unwounded men risked their lives to carry injured comrades to safety, often abandoning tactical positions to perform acts of mercy. But the fire also created unexpected tactical opportunities. The smoke provided concealment for troop movements, allowing commanders to reposition their forces without detection. Union General Hancock used the cover to reorganize his scattered divisions, while Confederate officers attempted to coordinate their own units through a combination of bugle calls and shouted commands that could barely be heard above the roar of the flames. As the afternoon progressed, both armies found themselves fighting not just each other but the forest itself. Soldiers used bayonets and rifle butts to beat down flames threatening their positions, while officers commandeered any available water to create fire breaks around field hospitals and ammunition supplies. The tactical objectives that had seemed so important in the morning began to pale in comparison to the immediate necessity of survival. The fire reached its peak intensity around 4 in the afternoon, when a sudden shift in wind direction sent walls of flame racing across previously safe areas. Entire regiments were forced to abandon carefully prepared defensive positions, while artillery batteries limbered their guns and retreated to avoid having their ammunition supplies ignited by the approaching conflagration. General Grant, observing the battle from his headquarters near Wilderness Tavern, made the difficult decision to suspend offensive operations until the fire had burned itself out. His staff officers, many of them veterans of Western campaigns, had never witnessed anything comparable to the hellish scene unfolding in the Virginia forest. The Union commander's famous composure was tested as reports arrived describing entire companies missing and presumed consumed by the flames. Ironically, the fire that had initially seemed to favor neither side ultimately benefited Lee's smaller army. Grant's numerical advantage became meaningless when visibility was reduced to a few yards and unit cohesion became impossible to maintain. The Confederate Army, more familiar with the local terrain and better adapted to irregular warfare, found it easier to maintain some semblance of organization in the chaotic conditions. As evening approached and the fire gradually burned itself out, both armies began to assess the day's losses. The casualty reports made grim reading. Thousands of men had fallen to enemy fire, and hundreds more had been claimed by the flames that had transformed the wilderness into a crematorium. As the forest fires began to subside in the late afternoon of May 6, 1864, General Longstreet prepared to exploit what appeared to be a significant tactical advantage. His flanking attack had successfully disrupted Hancock's advance, and Confederate forces were beginning to reorganize for what might prove to be a decisive assault against the Union left flank. Victory seemed within reach for Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Longstreet, accompanied by his staff and several brigade commanders, rode forward through the smoke-filled forest to personally reconnoiter the Union positions and coordinate the next phase of the attack. His presence near the front lines was characteristic of his leadership style. He believed in seeing the battlefield conditions firsthand rather than directing operations from a distant headquarters. The Confederate general and his entourage were moving along a narrow forest path near the Orange Plank Road when tragedy struck with devastating suddenness. A Virginia regiment, disoriented by the smoke and confused by the irregular nature of the fighting, mistook Longstreet's party for Union cavalry and opened fire at close range. The volley, delivered from less than 50 yards away, was devastating in its effect. Longstreet himself was struck by a musket ball that entered his throat and passed through his right shoulder, creating a wound that was both immediately life-threatening and permanently debilitating. The bullet severed major blood vessels and damaged nerves that would never fully heal, effectively ending the military career of one of the Confederacy's most capable field commanders. Military medical records preserved in the National Archives, as analyzed in Harold M. Knudson's Confederate Medicine, indicate that Longstreet's wound was remarkably similar to the one that had killed Stonewall Jackson exactly 1 year earlier at Chancellorsville, also inflicted by friendly fire in a Virginia forest. The wounding of Longstreet created immediate chaos in the Confederate command structure. His corps, which had been preparing for a coordinated assault that might have achieved a breakthrough, suddenly found itself leaderless at the crucial moment when tactical decision-making was most critical. Staff officers rushed to evacuate their wounded commander while trying to maintain the momentum of the attack. General Charles Field temporarily assumed command of the First Corps, but he lacked both Longstreet's tactical genius and his authority over the subordinate division commanders. The carefully planned assault began to lose its coordination as individual brigade commanders made independent decisions about when and where to attack the Union positions. Lee, upon receiving news of Longstreet's wounding, immediately recognized the magnitude of the crisis. Longstreet had been his most reliable subordinate, the commander he trusted to execute complex maneuvers without detailed supervision. His loss came at precisely the moment when Confederate forces were poised to exploit their tactical advantage and potentially achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them throughout the campaign. The impact on Confederate morale was equally devastating. Longstreet was beloved by his men, who had followed him through countless battles and trusted his tactical judgment implicitly. News of his wounding spread rapidly through the ranks, creating uncertainty and confusion among soldiers who had been advancing confidently just moments before. Despite the crisis, some Confederate units continued their assault against Hancock's reorganizing forces. General William Mahone's Virginia Brigade managed to achieve a limited breakthrough along the Orange Plank Road, capturing several hundred Union prisoners and threatening to roll up the Federal left flank. But without Longstreet's coordinating presence, these successes remained isolated and could not be effectively exploited. Hancock's Second Corps, given time to recover from the initial shock of the flanking attack, began to establish defensive positions that would prove increasingly difficult to assault. The Union general, despite his own wounds suffered earlier in the day, personally supervised the deployment of artillery and infantry, that would anchor the Federal left flank for the remainder of the battle. As darkness began to fall over the wilderness, both armies found themselves essentially back where they had started 48 hours earlier. Grant's offensive had been stopped, but Lee's army had been unable to achieve the decisive victory that might have ended the Union campaign. The cost had been enormous, over 28,000 casualties in 2 days of fighting, with the majority of the losses concentrated among the veteran units that both armies could least afford to lose. The wounding of Longstreet symbolized the larger tragedy of the Battle of the Wilderness, an engagement that had promised decisive results but had instead produced only mutual exhaustion and unprecedented carnage in the tangled Virginia forest that had become a graveyard for both armies. As dawn broke gray and somber over the Wilderness on May 7, 1864, the forest fell silent for the first time in 3 days. The guns had ceased their thunder, the musketry had died away, and an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield where more than 28,000 Americans had fallen in what many would later call the most savage fighting of the entire Civil War. General Grant sat outside his tent near Wilderness Tavern, methodically whittling a piece of wood as he contemplated the reports spread before him. The casualty figures made for grim reading. 17,500 Union soldiers killed, wounded, or missing, compared to approximately 11,000 Confederate losses. By any traditional military calculation, the battle had been a tactical defeat for the Union forces. Previous commanders of the Army of the Potomac, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, had all retreated after suffering such losses, falling back across the nearest river to lick their wounds and plan another campaign. For the following season, Lee's army had grown accustomed to this pattern, and Confederate soldiers were already beginning to celebrate what they assumed would be another strategic victory. But Grant was unlike any commander Lee had faced before. As he sat in the morning, stillness surrounded by the detritus of battle, abandoned equipment, makeshift graves, and the lingering smoke from still smoldering fires, the Union general-in-chief was not planning a retreat. Instead, he was studying maps of the roads leading south toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, planning the next phase of a campaign that would not end until one army or the other was completely destroyed. According to detailed accounts preserved in Grant's personal memoirs and corroborated by contemporary newspaper reports, as referenced in Gene Edward Smith's Grant, the general's decision to continue the offensive represented a fundamental shift in Union strategy that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. The decision to continue south rather than retreat north was perhaps the most important strategic choice made by any Union commander during the entire war. It signaled to both armies that this campaign would be different, that there would be no pause for reorganization, no seasonal cessation of hostilities, and no opportunity for the Confederacy to recover from its losses through diplomatic intervention or foreign recognition. When Grant's orders began circulating through the Union camps around noon on May 7th, the reaction among the soldiers was electric. Veterans who had experienced countless retreats after costly battles could hardly believe that they were being ordered to advance deeper into Virginia rather than return to the safety of the Rappahannock River crossings. The psychological impact on Confederate forces was equally profound. Lee's army, which had grown confident in its ability to repel Union offensives through tactical skill and defensive fighting, suddenly faced the prospect of continuous combat against an enemy commander who seemed indifferent to casualties and determined to press his numerical advantage regardless of the cost. As the Army of the Potomac began its movement south on the night of May 7th, the soldiers carried with them a new understanding of the war they were fighting. The Battle of the Wilderness had stripped away any remaining romantic notions about the conflict, revealing it as a struggle for survival that would be decided not by brilliant maneuvers or heroic charges, but by the grim arithmetic of attrition. Grant's decision to continue the offensive after the Wilderness established the template for the final year of the Civil War. From Spotsylvania to Cold Harbor to Petersburg, the Union Army would maintain constant pressure on Lee's forces, gradually wearing down the Confederate military through sustained combat that neither side could avoid. The forest itself bore silent witness to this transformation in the nature of the conflict. The wilderness, which had seemed to favor defensive tactics and tactical skill over raw numbers, had ultimately proven that no amount of cleverness could overcome the Union's advantages in manpower and industrial capacity when applied with relentless determination. Lee, recognizing the change in his opponent's approach, began to prepare his army for a new kind of warfare. The tactical victories that had sustained Confederate morale for 3 years would no longer be sufficient. From this point forward, the Army of Northern Virginia would be fighting for time. Time for foreign intervention, time for Northern war, weariness to affect the 1864 presidential election, time for some miraculous change in circumstances that might yet preserve Confederate independence. As the last Union soldiers disappeared into the darkness along the roads leading toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, the Battle of the Wilderness officially came to an end. But its significance extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. In those blood-soaked Virginia woods, Grant had committed the Union to a strategy of total war that would not cease until the Confederacy was completely defeated. The Wilderness had been Lee's last realistic opportunity to defeat a Union army in the field and potentially end the war through negotiation. That opportunity had been lost in the tangled undergrowth, consumed by fires that served as a metaphor for the larger conflagration that would now burn across Virginia until one side or the other was completely exhausted. The War of Attrition that would define Grant's Virginia campaign had begun, and with it the final chapter of the American Civil War.